Good morning and welcome to the Clovis Brief. I'm your host and this is Sunday, May 31st, 2026. Let's start with the weather for northern Illinois. Right now it's a cool 49 degrees, feeling like 45 with partly cloudy skies and a light wind at 4 miles per hour. Today we'll see overcast conditions with a high of 76 and a low around 49. Looking ahead, Monday stays overcast with a high of 77 and a low of 56. Tuesday clears up nicely with sunshine, a high near 69 and a low of 50. Wednesday and Thursday both return to overcast skies with highs in the mid-70s. So if you're planning outdoor activities, Tuesday looks like your best bet this week. Coming up today, we're covering major international developments including Israeli forces' deepest push into Lebanon in over 2 decades, Colombia's presidential election, and growing concerns about Belarus as a potential launchpad for Russian operations. In U.S. news, we'll discuss immigrant detention center conditions sparking lawsuits and Trump's plans for a national mall celebration as artists back out. On the local front, a Chicago tollway worker was fatally struck. There's controversy over a Lincoln Park school expansion, and Trump has made some pointed comments about the Pope's meeting with Chicago's mayor. In technology, we're diving into Microsoft Office's controversial view-only conversion affecting Mac users, a massive botnet disruption involving 17 million devices, the release of NixOS 26.05, and important discussions about domain expertise in the age of AI. Our security briefing is particularly critical today with active exploitation of a Palo Alto Network's authentication bypass vulnerability, a new Linux privilege escalation flaw, and concerning developments with CISA's own security practices. It's a packed Sunday edition, so let's get started. We begin with world and U.S. news, and the lead story comes from the Associated Press and Reuters, reporting that Israeli army forces have captured Beaufort Castle in southern Lebanon in what marks the deepest incursion into the country in 26 years. This strategic fortress, which has changed hands multiple times throughout Lebanon's turbulent history, sits on a prominent hilltop overlooking the Litani River. The capture represents a significant escalation in Israel's campaign against Hezbollah positions. Military analysts quoted by Reuters note that controlling Beaufort provides commanding views of southern Lebanon and northern Israel, making it a critical tactical position. The operation involved heavy fighting, and the Israeli Defense Forces have established a security perimeter around the site. This push deeper into Lebanese territory has raised concerns among international observers about the potential for wider regional conflict, particularly given the ongoing tensions with Iran. Staying in the Middle East, NPR and PBS NewsHour report that the United States Navy intercepted a merchant vessel attempting to breach the blockade and reach Iran. According to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, the ship was carrying what they describe as dual-use materials that could be employed for military purposes. The vessel, registered under a flag of convenience, was stopped in international waters and its crew detained for questioning. This incident highlights the ongoing enforcement of maritime restrictions as part of the broader confrontation with Iran. NPR notes that Iran has been attempting to circumvent sanctions and blockade measures through increasingly creative means, including the use of ship-to-ship transfers and circuitous routing through third countries. The interception comes as Iran continues to accuse the Trump administration of making what they call excessive demands in stalled nuclear negotiations. From South America, the Associated Press and BBC are covering Colombia's presidential election taking place today. Polls are open in what's being described as a referendum on outgoing President Gustavo Petro's left-wing policies. The race pits Petro's chosen successor against several opposition candidates, some of whom have positioned themselves as explicitly pro-Trump and pro-American alignment. The election comes as Colombia has accused Ecuador of interfering in the vote, according to PBS NewsHour. The accusations center on alleged social media manipulation campaigns and funding of opposition groups. This election is being closely watched in Washington as a test of leftist politics in Latin America and could significantly reshape U.S.-Colombia relations, particularly on issues like drug trafficking cooperation, trade, and regional security. The Associated Press notes that whoever wins will inherit significant challenges including ongoing peace process implementation with former FARC guerrillas, cocaine production at record levels, and economic pressures. Turning to Africa, multiple sources including the BBC and Associated Press are reporting alarming developments regarding the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Médecins Sans Frontières, also known as Doctors Without Borders, has issued a warning describing the spread as deeply alarming. The outbreak, centered in the eastern provinces, has now spread to at least 4 separate provinces, with healthcare workers particularly affected. This comes as the BBC also reports on a Kenyan court blocking the Trump administration from what was described as an attempt to deport or relocate Americans exposed to Ebola to Kenya. The plan, which had not been publicly announced in detail, apparently involved using Kenya as a quarantine location for U.S. citizens who had potential Ebola exposure but had not yet developed symptoms. The Kenyan High Court ruled this would violate both Kenyan sovereignty and international health protocols. The incident has sparked diplomatic tensions between Nairobi and Washington. In Europe, Reuters and the BBC report that NATO defense meetings in Singapore have been marked by sharp American criticism of European defense spending, even as NATO officials attempted to reassure Asian partners about the alliance's stability. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth reportedly used unusually blunt language in castigating European allies for failing to meet defense spending commitments, calling some contributions pathetic and demanding immediate increases. This comes as European nations and Asian partners are increasingly concerned about American commitment to collective security under the Trump administration. The BBC describes what they call the Great Indo-Pacific Hedge, where nations are developing deeper bilateral and multilateral defense ties with each other as insurance against potential American disengagement. Japan's defense minister, speaking at the same conference, defended his country's military posture while criticizing what he described as China's huge arsenal and aggressive behavior in the region. Reuters is reporting a fascinating and somewhat bizarre incident from Rome, where horses bolted through the city streets after a police officer lit fireworks during a parade rehearsal. The incident, which was captured on multiple smartphone videos that have gone viral on Italian social media, shows at least 6 mounted police horses panicking and running through central Rome, some still with riders desperately trying to regain control. Several people sustained minor injuries as pedestrians scrambled out of the way. The officer who lit the fireworks, described as having done so as a prank, has been suspended pending investigation. Italian officials are calling the incident unacceptable and dangerous, particularly given that the rehearsal was for Republic Day celebrations scheduled for June 2nd. Back in the United States, NBC News and ABC News are reporting on developing litigation over conditions at immigrant detention centers. A new lawsuit filed by detainees at a Texas ICE facility describes what attorneys are calling horrific conditions at Camp East Montana. The suit alleges overcrowding, inadequate medical care, limited access to legal counsel, and what detainees describe as deliberately punitive treatment. This comes as NPR reports on a separate situation at a New Jersey detention center where dueling protests faced off outside the facility. On one side, immigrant rights advocates and family members demanded improved conditions and releases, while on the other, groups supporting stricter immigration enforcement gathered in a counter-demonstration. New Jersey State Police had to establish protest zones to keep the groups separated. NBC News notes that ICE has been moving some operations from the New Jersey facility, though officials have not provided detailed explanations for the relocations. In legal and political news, NPR and The Hill report that a federal judge has agreed to review Trump's controversial $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund. This fund, established by executive order earlier this year, is intended to provide legal defense support and compensation for individuals and organizations that the administration believes were unfairly targeted by previous administrations or the deep state. Critics have called it a taxpayer-funded slush fund that bypasses normal appropriations processes. The judge's decision to review the fund came after a lawsuit brought by watchdog groups arguing it violates separation of powers and appropriations clauses of the Constitution. The Hill notes this is the first time a federal court has agreed to substantive review of the fund's legality. Politico and The Hill are covering Trump's Friday night endorsements in 3 gubernatorial Republican primaries, jumping into races in South Carolina, Iowa, and Oklahoma. In each case, Trump backed candidates who have explicitly aligned themselves with his policies and persona, and in 2 cases backed challengers to sitting Republican governors he views as insufficiently loyal. Politico describes this as part of Trump's broader effort to remake the Republican Party entirely in his image ahead of the 2028 presidential election. The endorsements have already created turbulence in state party organizations, with some Republican officials expressing frustration that Trump is creating divisive primaries rather than focusing on defeating Democrats in general elections. Finally, The Hill reports on escalating battles over redistricting ahead of the 2028 elections. The report notes that Louisiana Republicans have passed what critics call a gerrymandered map that eliminates a majority black congressional district, setting up certain legal challenges. Similar redistricting fights are brewing in several other states as parties position themselves for the next decade of electoral competition. The stakes are particularly high because the 2030 census and subsequent redistricting cycle will lock in political boundaries through 2040. Moving to local news for Chicago and Northern Illinois, we start with a tragic incident reported by WGN Chicago. A tollway maintenance worker was fatally struck by a car along Interstate 294. The worker, whose name has not yet been released pending family notification, was conducting routine maintenance work when they were hit by a vehicle that apparently did not move over or slow down as required by Illinois' move-over law. WGN reports this is the 3rd tollway worker death this year in the Chicago area, raising renewed concerns about driver compliance with safety laws designed to protect roadside workers. The Illinois State Police are investigating the crash, and charges are expected to be filed against the driver. Tollway officials released a statement emphasizing that drivers must move over a lane when approaching any vehicle with flashing lights, and if unable to move over, must slow down significantly below the posted speed limit. WGN Chicago is also covering a brewing controversy in Lincoln Park over a school expansion proposal that's facing opposition from residents. Francis Parker School, a private institution, has proposed expanding its campus, which would involve acquiring adjacent properties and constructing new facilities. Residents in the surrounding neighborhood have organized in opposition, raising concerns about increased traffic congestion, parking problems, loss of green space, and what they describe as the gradual commercialization of their residential area. A community meeting this week grew heated, with school officials arguing the expansion is necessary to meet growing enrollment and maintain competitive facilities, while neighbors countered that the school has grown beyond what the neighborhood infrastructure can support. The proposal will require various city approvals, and aldermanic support appears split at this point. In crime news, WGN Chicago reports that a man has been charged with sexually assaulting a woman in Labog Woods on the city's northwest side. The suspect, identified as a 34-year-old Chicago resident, was arrested after investigators connected him to the attack through surveillance footage from nearby businesses and DNA evidence. The assault occurred in broad daylight along one of the Forest Preserve's walking paths. Chicago police are asking anyone with information about other potential incidents to come forward, as they investigate whether the suspect may be connected to other unsolved cases. The arrest has provided some relief to residents who have been on edge since the attack, though it has also renewed calls for increased police patrols in the forest preserves. WGN is also reporting that a man found badly injured on the far north side has died from his injuries. The victim was discovered early Saturday morning in the 680 block of North Sheridan Road with what police described as trauma to his head and body. He was transported to St. Francis Hospital in Evanston in critical condition, but succumbed to his injuries Saturday evening. Chicago Police Area 3 detectives are investigating the death as a homicide, though they have not yet determined whether the injuries resulted from an assault, a fall, or other circumstances. No suspects are in custody, and police are canvassing the area for witnesses and video footage. In what's being characterized as an unusual diplomatic and political moment, WGN Chicago reports that former President Trump criticized Pope Leo XIV for meeting with Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, calling Johnson useless in a social media post. The Pope met with Mayor Johnson during a brief stopover at O'Hare International Airport while traveling between papal visits in Mexico and the United States East Coast. The meeting, which the Archdiocese of Chicago characterized as a courtesy call, lasted approximately 15 minutes and covered topics including immigration, poverty, and urban violence. Trump's post characterized the meeting as the Pope wasting time with failed Democrat mayors and specifically called Johnson possibly the most useless mayor in America. The mayor's office declined to respond directly to Trump's comments, instead releasing a statement saying they were honored by His Holiness's visit and meaningful discussion. The incident has sparked debate about the appropriateness of criticizing papal diplomatic engagements. Finally, WGN Chicago's weather team is forecasting that today, May 31st, will bring a mix of sun and clouds with a breeze to Chicagoland. High temperatures will reach the mid-70s, making it a pleasant day for outdoor activities despite the overcast conditions. The breeze will pick up through the afternoon with sustained winds of 10 to 15 miles per hour and gusts up to 25 miles per hour. It's May's final day, and we're heading into a June that forecasters say will start warmer than normal before potentially cooling down mid-month. Let's move into technology news, and we're leading with a story that's generated enormous discussion on Hacker News, where it's garnered over 800 points and 300 comments. Microsoft has initiated what's being called a view-only conversion for Office 2019 and 2021 for Mac users. According to the discussion and supporting documentation that's been compiled on Consumer Rights Wiki, Microsoft is converting previously perpetual licenses into view-only mode, meaning users who paid for permanent copies of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint can now only read files, not edit or create them, unless they subscribe to Microsoft 365. This represents a fundamental change to the software license that users originally purchased under the understanding they would have full functionality permanently. The Hacker News discussion includes numerous users reporting that their purchased copies suddenly displaying messages about needing subscriptions, with some saying Microsoft support has told them this is by design. Others report that downgrading to older versions or using third-party tools to block the authentication checks are the only workarounds. This story touches on broader concerns about software licensing, digital ownership, and whether companies can retroactively change the terms of purchases users thought were permanent. Consumer advocacy groups are exploring whether this constitutes a breach of contract or false advertising. Staying on Hacker News, a post with over 250 points is generating conversation about the rsync project and what's titled "Please Do Not Vibe Fuck Up This Software." The discussion centers on a GitHub issue in the rsync repository, where users are debating proposed changes to the venerable file synchronization tool. rsync has been a Unix and Linux staple for decades, known for its reliability and efficiency. The controversy arose when contributors proposed modernizing certain aspects of the code base and user interface. Longtime users pushed back strongly, arguing that rsync works perfectly as is and that unnecessary changes risk introducing bugs or breaking compatibility with the countless scripts and systems that depend on its current behavior. The phrase "vibe fuck up" appears to have originated from a user trying to express that while individual proposed changes might seem reasonable in isolation, collectively they would alter the fundamental character and reliability that makes rsync trusted infrastructure. This connects to a broader tension in open-source software between modernization and stability, and whether "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" should apply to critical infrastructure tools. Related to this discussion, Hacker News is also highlighting OpenRSync, with a post receiving over 400 points. OpenRSync is an implementation of rsync developed by the OpenBSD team, led by Kristaps Dzonsons. The OpenBSD project has a history of creating cleanroom reimplementations of common Unix tools with an emphasis on security, code clarity, and liberal licensing. OpenRSync aims to be compatible with the original rsync protocol while being simpler, more maintainable, and more secure by design. The project strips away some of rsync's more obscure features in favor of a smaller, more auditable codebase. Hacker News commenters are discussing whether this represents the right approach to critical infrastructure tools. Should we maintain backward compatibility with decades of accumulated features, or should we periodically start fresh with modern security practices and cleaner architectures? Some users note that OpenRSync is already being used in production environments where security is paramount, while others point out edge cases where original rsync's features are genuinely needed. Ars Technica and Bleeping Computer are both reporting on the takedown of a massive botnet. According to Ars Technica, Dutch authorities working with international partners have dismantled a botnet comprising more than 17 million infected devices. Krebs on Security provides additional detail, reporting that Dutch law enforcement seized approximately 800 servers and arrested 2 individuals in connection with operating infrastructure that facilitated cyberattacks. The botnet, which has not been named in initial reports, was apparently used for DDoS attacks, spam distribution, and credential theft. Bleeping Computer notes this represents one of the largest botnet disruptions in recent history by device count. The operation involved coordination between Dutch police, Europol, and law enforcement agencies from several other countries. What's particularly notable is that the botnet appeared to be operated as a commercial service, with customers paying to use portions of the botnet for various malicious purposes. This connects to a broader trend Bleeping Computer has been covering regarding DDoS as a service platforms, where cybercriminals can rent attack infrastructure starting at prices as low as $5, dramatically lowering the barrier to entry for conducting sophisticated cyberattacks. Lobsters is highlighting the release of NixOS 26.05, the latest version of the Linux distribution known for its unique approach to package management and system configuration. NixOS uses a declarative configuration model where the entire system configuration is specified in a single file or set of files, making systems reproducible and allowing for atomic upgrades and rollbacks. The 26.05 release includes updated packages across the board, improvements to the Nix package manager itself, better support for Wayland display servers, and enhanced tooling for container and cloud deployments. For those unfamiliar with NixOS, the distribution represents a fundamentally different approach to Linux system administration compared to traditional distributions like Ubuntu or Fedora. Instead of imperatively installing packages and modifying configuration files, you describe the desired system state, and NixOS makes it so. This makes it particularly popular among developers and system administrators who value reproducibility. You can take your NixOS configuration file to a different machine and produce an identical system. The release notes indicate significant work has gone into improving the developer experience and documentation, addressing one of the traditional barriers to NixOS adoption. Hacker News has a thoughtful essay titled "Domain Expertise Has Always Been the Real Moat" that's generated 600 points and over 360 comments. The piece, published on breathbursting.com, argues that despite all the hype around AI and automation, deep domain expertise in specific fields remains the most defensible competitive advantage for individuals and organizations. The author contends that while AI can handle increasingly complex tasks, it fundamentally lacks the contextual understanding, intuition, and experiential knowledge that comes from years of working in a specific domain. The Hacker News discussion includes perspectives from software engineers, doctors, lawyers, and specialists in various fields. Many agree that AI is excellent at tasks that can be precisely specified, but struggles with the ambiguous, context-dependent problems that domain experts solve daily. Others point out that AI is rapidly improving and that the nature of valuable domain expertise is shifting, from knowing facts to knowing how to effectively use tools including AI to solve problems. Some commenters note that this is creating a stratification where elite experts become more valuable while those with mid-level expertise see their roles automated away. This connects to broader questions about education, career development, and economic structure in an AI-augmented world. Ars Technica has published a story titled "Grifters, Cynics, and True Believers: The Family Tree of Vaccine Opponents." The piece traces the historical evolution of anti-vaccine movements from early skeptics of smallpox vaccination through today's more organized opposition. What's particularly interesting from a technology perspective is how the article examines the role of social media and algorithmic content distribution in amplifying vaccine hesitancy. The piece distinguishes between 3 categories: grifters who profit from selling alternative health products and fear-mongering, cynics who don't necessarily believe anti-vaccine rhetoric but use it for political or social advantage, and true believers who genuinely think vaccines are dangerous. Ars Technica's analysis shows how modern technology has allowed these groups to find each other, organize more effectively, and spread their messages more widely than ever before. The article is particularly timely given ongoing measles outbreaks, including one in Texas that Ars Technica covered separately, showing how declining vaccination rates have real public health consequences. The piece raises questions about platform responsibility, the limits of content moderation, and how scientific institutions should communicate with a public that increasingly distrusts expert authority. Finally, from Ars Technica, there's a story about the Trump administration's FCC warning all broadcasters to follow orders or be punished like ABC. This follows an earlier settlement between the FCC and ABC after the network aired content the administration deemed problematic. The new FCC directive, issued to all broadcast license holders, emphasizes that broadcasters have responsibilities regarding content decisions and that failing to meet these responsibilities could result in license review or revocation. First Amendment and media law experts quoted by Ars Technica describe the warning as unprecedented and potentially unconstitutional prior restraint on press freedom. The directive doesn't specify exactly what content would be problematic, which critics say creates a chilling effect where broadcasters self-censor out of fear rather than clear legal standards. This has significant implications for technology platforms as well, as the FCC's jurisdiction is being interpreted more broadly by this administration to potentially include streaming services and internet-based content distributors that have traditionally been outside broadcast regulation. It's time for our security briefing, and we need to lead with a critical actively exploited vulnerability. Leaping Computer and the CISA Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog are reporting that CV-2026-257, a Palo Alto Network's PAN-OS authentication bypass vulnerability, is now being exploited in attacks. This vulnerability allows attackers to bypass security restrictions and establish unauthorized access to GlobalProtect VPN gateways without valid credentials. CISA added this to their KEV catalog on May 29th with a due date of June 1st, that's tomorrow, for federal agencies to patch or remove affected systems from their networks. The vulnerability affects multiple versions of PAN-OS, and Palo Alto Networks released patches several weeks ago, but the exploitation in the wild means organizations that haven't patched are actively at risk. Leaping Computer reports that the exploitation attempts appear to be scanning widely for vulnerable systems rather than targeted at specific organizations, which means anyone running vulnerable versions should consider themselves at immediate risk. The authentication bypass could allow attackers to establish VPN connections, pivot into internal networks, and potentially exfiltrate data or deploy ransomware. If your organization uses Palo Alto GlobalProtect VPNs, this needs to be your top priority this weekend. Leaping Computer is also reporting on a new Linux vulnerability dubbed CIF Switch that gives root access on multiple distributions. This privilege escalation flaw affects the CIFS, Common Internet File System, implementation in the Linux kernel and can be exploited by a local attacker with low-level privileges to gain full root access. The vulnerability affects multiple major distributions including Ubuntu, Debian, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and their derivatives. What makes this particularly concerning is that many Linux systems use CIFS for network file sharing with Windows systems, meaning the attack surface is broader than vulnerabilities in less common subsystems. Patches are being rolled out by various distribution maintainers, but Leaping Computer notes that the patching process is complicated by the fact that different distributions ship different kernel versions with different feature sets, meaning the vulnerability manifests slightly differently across systems. System administrators should prioritize applying kernel updates from their distribution providers and, until patching is complete, should review which users have the ability to mount CIFS shares, as this is a prerequisite for exploitation. Moving to CISA's Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog, we have several concerning entries from this past week. CV-2026-48027 affects NX console, where an embedded malicious code vulnerability allowed a compromised version to be published. This is a supply chain attack where attackers managed to publish a malicious version of the popular development tool to the NPM registry. The compromised extension could steal credentials and potentially provide backdoor access to developer machines. This was added to CISA's KEV on May 27th with a due date of June 10th. Similarly, CV-2026-45321 affects TanStack, another popular development tool, where malicious versions were published to NPM to steal credentials. These supply chain attacks on development tools are particularly insidious because they target developers who often have elevated access to systems and source code repositories. CISA added CV 2000 and 26-8398, affecting Daemon Tools Lite on May 27th with a due date of May 30th. That was yesterday. This vulnerability has high impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, though CISA's description doesn't provide specific details about the nature of the flaw. The tight deadline suggests CISA has intelligence about active exploitation or imminent risk. CV 2000 and 26-48172 in Lightspeed's cPanel plugin was added May 26th with a due date of May 29th, also yesterday. This privilege escalation vulnerability can be exploited through the user-end cPanel plugin by any cPanel user to gain elevated privileges on the system. For hosting providers using cPanel with Lightspeed, this is critical. It means any customer with a hosting account could potentially compromise the entire server. We also have CV 2000 and 26-9082, a SQL injection vulnerability in Drupal core added on May 22nd. This is particularly serious because it can allow privilege escalation and remote code execution via specially crafted requests. Drupal powers many enterprise and government websites, and SQL injection vulnerabilities can be devastating. Attackers can extract entire databases, modify content, or execute arbitrary code on the web server. Krebs on Security has been covering several major stories this week. First, there's the previously mentioned Netherlands operation seizing 800 servers and arresting 2 people for aiding cyber attacks. This ties into that massive botnet disruption we discussed earlier. But Krebs also has extensive coverage of what he's calling a CISA data leak scandal. According to Krebs, lawmakers are demanding answers as CISA tries to contain a data leak where a CISA administrator accidentally leaked AWS GovCloud credentials on GitHub. GovCloud is Amazon's cloud platform specifically designed for government workloads with strict compliance and security requirements. The exposed credentials potentially gave access to sensitive government systems and data. What makes this particularly embarrassing is that CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is the organization responsible for advising the rest of the government on cybersecurity best practices. Krebs reports that the credentials were committed to a public GitHub repository as part of code that was being developed and apparently sat exposed for several weeks before being discovered. CISA has rotated the credentials and says they've found no evidence of unauthorized access, but the incident has raised serious questions about CISA's own security practices and whether the agency was following the guidance it provides to others. Krebs on Security also covered the arrest of an individual known online as Dort, allegedly the operator of the Kimwolf botnet, who was charged in both the US and Canada. This arrest appears related to the broader botnet takedown operation. According to Krebs, Dort was allegedly running a botnet for hire service and is facing charges including computer fraud, conspiracy, and facilitating cyber attacks. The international cooperation between US and Canadian authorities in this case represents the kind of coordination necessary to tackle cybercrime that operates across borders. Bleeping Computer reports that ChatGPT share links are being abused to host fake outage pages that deliver malware. Attackers are creating ChatGPT conversations that contain content mimicking service outage notifications for popular services like Microsoft, Google, or Adobe. They then share these ChatGPT conversation links through phishing emails or social media. Because the links go to legitimate chat.openai.com domains, they bypass many security filters and look trustworthy. When victims click thinking they're checking on a service outage, they're presented with ChatGPT-generated content that includes links to download urgent security updates or temporary access tools that are actually malware. This is a clever abuse of the trust people place in legitimate domains and the shareability features of AI chat interfaces. OpenAI is working to detect and remove these malicious shared conversations, but it's a cat-and-mouse game. Bleeping Computer also reports that California's Attorney General has sued 23andMe over the 2023 data breach that exposed health data. The lawsuit filed this week alleges that 23andMe failed to implement adequate security measures and failed to promptly notify affected individuals about the breach. The 2023 breach exposed genetic and health information for millions of users through a credential stuffing attack where attackers used passwords leaked from other services to access 23andMe accounts. The lawsuit seeks damages and changes to 23andMe's security practices. This is particularly significant because genetic data is uniquely sensitive. Unlike passwords which can be changed, your genetic information is permanent and immutable. In slightly better news, Bleeping Computer reports that Google Chrome is adding session cookie theft protection for all users. This new security feature, rolling out in Chrome's latest version, makes it significantly harder for malware or malicious browser extensions to steal session cookies, which are used to maintain login state on websites. Stolen session cookies are a common way attackers bypass two-factor authentication. Even if your password is secure and you use 2FA, if an attacker can steal your active session cookie, they can impersonate you without needing your password or 2FA codes. Google's implementation uses operating system-level security features to encrypt and isolate cookie storage in ways that make it much more difficult for other software to access. This is being rolled out broadly after being tested with high-risk users and represents a significant improvement in Chrome's security posture. Finally, Bleeping Computer reports that a man has been sentenced to prison for selling data on 7 million elderly Americans. The individual, whose name Bleeping Computer provides but I won't repeat to avoid giving him attention, was selling detailed personal information including names, addresses, phone numbers, dates of birth, and in some cases social security numbers of elderly Americans to scammers who use the data for various fraud schemes. The targeting of elderly individuals makes this particularly egregious, as this demographic is disproportionately victimized by scams. The sentence reportedly includes significant prison time and restitution, though the latter is unlikely to be fully paid. This case highlights the ecosystem of data brokers and information sellers that enable fraud at scale. Segment 6, AI and Machine Learning. Let's dive into the latest AI research and industry developments. The archive preprint server has been busy with some fascinating papers that just dropped. First up, we have archive 2605.30353, a paper titled Physics is All You Need, a case study in physicist-supervised AI development of scientific software. This is actually a really interesting meta-study about AI development itself. The researchers present what they call a quantified case study where a physicist supervised an AI coding agent, specifically Claude Code, in developing scientific software. The key question they're asking is fundamental. Are AI agents tools, co-authors, or researchers? This matters enormously as we think about the future of scientific computing and research. When a physicist works with Claude to develop simulation code or analysis tools, what's actually happening there? Is the AI just autocomplete on steroids, or is it participating in the research process itself? The paper examines the workflow, the decision-making process, and where human expertise remains irreplaceable versus where the AI actually contributes meaningfully. This is particularly relevant given the explosion of AI-assisted coding tools in scientific computing. Next, Archive 2605.30351 tackles video MLA. Low-rank latent KV cache for minute-scale autoregressive video diffusion. Now this is getting into the weeds of how we generate longer videos with AI. The researchers are addressing a key bottleneck in video generation models. Long rollout causal video diffusion has converged on using a fixed-size sliding window key-value cache, but that creates limitations. What video MLA does is innovate on the cache structure itself by using low-rank decomposition of the latent representations. This allows the model to generate minute-scale videos autoregressively without running out of memory or losing coherence. For anyone following the video generation space, and after all the excitement around Sora and similar models, this kind of architectural optimization is what makes the difference between generating 10 seconds of video versus generating actual usable content that could be a minute or longer. Moving on to robotics, Archive 2605.3035 presents Dina Flip, Rethinking Robotics Perception via Trimodal Dynamics Guided Representation. This paper argues that robot manipulation critically depends on perception that preserves action-relevant aspects of a scene, but most robot learning pipelines aren't built with this in mind. DynaFlip proposes a trimodal approach combining visual, tactile, and proprioceptive information, guided by dynamics modeling. The key insight is that what matters for a robot isn't just seeing the scene accurately, it's perceiving the scene in a way that's coupled to the actions the robot can take. This is actually quite similar to how humans perceive the world. We don't process visual information in isolation. We process it in the context of what we can do, what we felt, and how our body is positioned. The researchers demonstrate improved manipulation performance by learning representations that are explicitly grounded in these multimodal dynamics. Now here's one for anyone working with large language models. Archive 2605.30348 LLM Surgeon. Diagnosing data mixture of large language models. The researchers describe the pre-training data mixture as a model's digital DNA, and they're right. The mixture of data used to train these models fundamentally shapes their behaviors, capabilities, and failure modes. But here's the problem: for most commercial models, we have no idea what's in that mixture. LLM Surgeon provides techniques to reverse engineer or diagnose the data mixture of a trained LLM by analyzing its behavior patterns, biases, and knowledge distribution. This is crucial for transparency, for understanding model limitations, and for debugging unexpected behaviors. If a model consistently gets facts wrong about certain topics or time periods, LLM Surgeon-style analysis can help determine whether that's because those topics were underrepresented in training, misrepresented, or contaminated with errors. Archive 2605.30345 moves us into hardware design with SGEN, PCB schematic generation with semantic-grounded code representations. Printed circuit board schematic design defines nearly all electronic hardware, but it remains manual and expertise-intensive. SGEN applies generative AI to automate PCB schematic creation using semantic-grounded code representations. What's interesting here is the approach of representing schematics as code rather than pure graphical generation. This allows the model to understand the functional relationships between components, not just their visual arrangement. You can imagine prompting the system with high-level requirements. I need a power supply that outputs 5 volts at 2 amps with overcurrent protection, and having it generate a schematic that's not just visually correct but functionally sound. Finally, Archive 2605.30344 addresses time series analysis with tiny but trusted, efficient vision language reasoning for time series anomaly detection. Vision language models have achieved impressive performance across many tasks, but prior studies report unsatisfactory performance on time series anomaly detection. The researchers here develop efficient techniques for applying VLM reasoning to time series data, making the models both smaller and more reliable for detecting anomalies in industrial monitoring, financial data, and system logs. The tiny but trusted framing is important for production deployment. You often can't use massive models, and you absolutely need reliability. False positives and false negatives in anomaly detection have real costs. On the industry front, we're seeing continued development in AI agent frameworks. GitHub Trending is showing strong interest in Cursor plugins and Anthropic's Claude Code repository. Claude Code, which came up in that first paper, represents Anthropic's push into agentic coding assistance. Meanwhile, the open-source community continues building tools for local LLM deployment, with ongoing work on Llama CPP optimizations and new quantization techniques. The conversation around AI safety and regulation continues to evolve. We're seeing tension between open-weight models that anyone can run locally, which raises safety concerns but also democratizes access, and the more controlled approach of API-only access. That archive paper on free, private AI models that will never say no gets at this tension. When you run a model locally, there's no safety layer, no content filtering, no alignment. That's both liberating and concerning depending on your perspective and the use case. The rapid pace of AI development continues unabated, with papers like these showing progress in video generation, robotics, scientific computing, hardware design, and time series analysis. The field is maturing from pure research into production engineering, which is exactly what we need for AI to move from DMOS to deployed systems. Segment 7, HOMELAB and Infrastructure. Let's talk infrastructure, home labs, and the tools we use to keep everything running. There's been quite a bit of movement in the home lab and container space this past week. Starting with major releases, NixOS 26.05 just dropped, and it's getting solid attention on Lobsters with an 89-point discussion. For those not familiar with NixOS, it's a Linux distribution built on the Nix package manager with a completely declarative approach to system configuration. Everything about your system is defined in configuration files, and you can rebuild your entire system from those files reproducibly. The 26.05 release brings improvements to the module system, better handling of secrets, and continued refinement of the Flakes feature, which has become the preferred way to manage dependencies and configurations. If you're running infrastructure as code or you want your home lab to be truly reproducible, where you can blow away a system and rebuild it identically, NixOS is worth looking at. The learning curve is steep, but the benefits are substantial once you're over that hump. On the programming language front, Racket version 9.2 was released this week, as noted on Hacker News with 122 points. Racket might seem like an esoteric choice for infrastructure work, but it's actually quite powerful for building domain-specific languages and automation tools. The 9.2 release includes performance improvements and refinements to the Racketonche backend. If you're doing any kind of meta-programming or building custom tools for infrastructure automation, Racket's macro system is unmatched. The Zig programming language continues to advance its ELF linker, according to Lobsters. Zig is increasingly popular for systems programming and infrastructure tools because it gives you C-like performance and control with much better safety guarantees and a more ergonomic build system. The linker improvements matter for anyone building tools that need to run efficiently on Linux servers. We're also seeing continued development of Roto, a compiled scripting language for Rust that's aimed at network automation. The one-year retrospective from NLNet Labs shows how it's being used for BGP policy scripting and other network automation tasks. This is exactly the kind of tool that makes network infrastructure more programmable without sacrificing performance. For containerization, the big story continues to be the evolution beyond Docker. OpenRSync and implementation of rsync by the OpenBSD team hit 412 points on Hacker News. Now you might wonder what rsync has to do with containers, but it's actually crucial for efficient data synchronization between containers from build contexts and for backup systems. The OpenBSD implementation focuses on security and simplicity, which are exactly what you want in infrastructure tools. And speaking of rsync, there's a fascinating discussion thread titled, "Please do not vibe fuck up this software" on the rsync project GitHub that's gotten 261 points. It's a discussion about keeping rsync focused and not adding unnecessary features that would complicate what's been a rock-solid tool for decades. GitHub Trending is showing strong interest in developer tooling this week. Microsoft's Markdown tool for converting various document formats to Markdown is getting attention, as is MoneyPrinter Turbo for automated video generation. But more relevant to infrastructure work, we're seeing activity around Harness from RevFactory, which is an open-source continuous delivery platform. The shift toward open-source CD tools continues as teams look for alternatives to proprietary CI/CD services. For those running Kubernetes, Helm chart development continues to be active. The ecosystem around K3s, the lightweight Kubernetes distribution, keeps growing. If you're running Kubernetes in a home lab or edge environment, K3s gives you real Kubernetes without the resource overhead of a full cluster. Paired with tools like K3D for local development, you can iterate on Kubernetes configs on your laptop before deploying to production. On the networking side, we're seeing continued interest in eBPF for network observability and security. The ability to run programs safely in the Linux kernel without kernel modules is transforming how we monitor and secure network traffic. If you're running any kind of production infrastructure, eBPF-based tools like Cilium for Kubernetes networking or Falco for runtime security are becoming standard. For those using Proxmox, which is hugely popular in the home lab community, we're coming up on the next major release. Proxmox VE continues to be the go-to choice for running both VMS and containers on the same hardware with a nice web interface. The integration with Ceph for distributed storage and the ability to live migrate VMS between hosts makes it feel almost enterprise-grade while remaining accessible for home lab use. Unraid, another popular home lab platform, recently updated its Docker container management. For anyone not familiar, Unraid takes a different approach from traditional RAID by allowing mixed drive sizes and providing per-array parity. Combined with robust Docker and VM support, it's become a favorite for media servers and home lab all-in-ones. On the firewall front, OPNsense continues its development cadence. The open-source firewall distribution based on FreeBSD provides enterprise features like VPN, traffic shaping, and intrusion detection in a package that's accessible for home lab use. The recent updates have focused on improving the web interface and expanding plugin support. Now, specifically looking at AHEAD resources from the feed, there are several significant pieces worth highlighting. AHEAD has published Production Inference in the Enterprise, Lessons from Testing Intel Gaudi 3, which covers real-world experience deploying Intel's AI accelerators for inference workloads. This is particularly timely given the interest in alternatives to NVIDIA GPUs. They've also published The Case for Hybrid AI Factories in AV/ADAS Development, examining how autonomous vehicle development requires both cloud and on-premises infrastructure. The piece titled Inside AHEAD's Role as Microsoft's first strategic Azure Storage Services partner details their work optimizing Azure storage for enterprise workloads. Another AHEAD resource covers from AI assistants to autonomous operations, tracking the evolution from simple chatbots to systems that can actually manage infrastructure. They've also published material on their physical AI factory concept, which is about building hybrid infrastructure for autonomous vehicle and robotics workloads. For anyone deploying AI infrastructure, their executive playbook for liquid-cooled infrastructure for AI is worth reading. Liquid cooling is becoming necessary for high-density GPU clusters. AHEAD also released benchmarks for LLM inference on Intel Gaudi 3, comparing single-card performance for enterprise workloads. This kind of real-world testing is valuable because vendor benchmarks often don't reflect actual deployment scenarios. Their ServiceNow Knowledge 2026 recap highlights what actually matters from the conference for IT operations teams. And they have a piece on turning Broadcom VCF and VKS entitlements into a modern private cloud, which is particularly relevant given all the changes VMware customers are navigating. All of this content from AHEAD is available at ahead.com. And it represents the kind of deep technical work that bridges the gap between vendor promises and production reality. The home lab and infrastructure space continues to evolve rapidly, with better tools, more options, and an increasingly sophisticated open-source ecosystem. Whether you're running a few containers at home or managing production infrastructure, there's never been a better time to build reliable, maintainable systems. Segment 8, A Science and Space. Let's move from infrastructure to the infinite and talk about what's happening in space and science. NASA has been busy as usual, and there are some fascinating developments to cover. Starting with NASA breaking news, the Johnson Space Center has a new infrastructure contract that was just awarded. NASA announced the contract for infrastructure work at Johnson Space Center in Houston, which is the home of mission control and astronaut training. This kind of infrastructure investment is crucial for maintaining the facilities that support human spaceflight operations. Johnson has been the heart of America's human spaceflight program since the Apollo era, and keeping that infrastructure modern and functional is essential as we push toward Artemis lunar missions and eventually Mars. Speaking of space missions, NASA hosted the SpaceX Crewmanus 11 astronauts for a public event at headquarters. Crewmanus 11 is part of the ongoing commercial crew program rotation to the International Space Station. These public events are important for maintaining public engagement with the space program and giving the astronauts a chance to share their experiences and perspectives before their mission. On the hardware front, NASA's Roman Space Telescope primary mirror just got its last look before integration. The Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope, previously known as WFIRST, is going to be NASA's next great astrophysics mission. Its primary mission is to investigate dark energy and search for exoplanets, but it will also do general astrophysics. The telescope has a field of view 100 times larger than Hubble, which means it can survey huge swaths of the sky efficiently. The fact that the primary mirror is getting its final inspection means we're getting closer to launch, currently targeted for the late 2020s. This mirror has been through extensive testing to ensure it can withstand the launch environment and then operate in the extreme conditions of space. Turning to Hubble, which continues to be productive decades after launch, we have two new image releases. First, Hubble spied a faint, irregular galaxy, one of those small, chaotic galaxies that don't fit neatly into the traditional spiral or elliptical categories. These irregular galaxies are often rich in gas and actively forming stars, making them interesting laboratories for understanding stellar evolution. Hubble also captured Mediate on its journey toward the center of the Virgo cluster. Mediate is a spiral galaxy being affected by its environment as it moves through the hot gas of the cluster. Observing galaxies in clusters helps us understand how galactic evolution is influenced by environment, not just by a galaxy's own internal processes. The NASA astronomy picture of the day has been featuring some stunning imagery this week, though the specific titles weren't in the feed. For those who don't follow APOD, it's been running daily since 1995, featuring a different astronomical image every day with a brief explanation written by professional astronomers. It's one of the most consistently excellent resources on the internet, and the archive is a treasure trove if you ever want to fall down a rabbit hole of astronomical imagery. Beyond NASA, there's been interesting science news from other sources. Ars Technica covered the analysis of a Texas measles outbreak that shows just how dangerous the virus is. Measles has a case fatality rate that's low but non-zero, and the complications can be severe, including encephalitis. The article examines how measles spreads in undervaccinated populations and what that means for public health. With vaccination rates declining in some communities, we're seeing measles outbreaks that simply wouldn't happen in a well-vaccinated population. Measles is one of the most contagious viruses we know of, with an R0 around 15 to 18, meaning one infected person will infect 15 to 18 others in a completely susceptible population. There's also a fascinating biological story about mosquitoes and DEET. A paper published in the Journal of Experimental Biology examines associative learning in Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. The researchers found that these mosquitoes can learn to switch DEET from aversive to appetitive. DEET is the most common mosquito repellent, and it works by being unpleasant to mosquitoes. But if mosquitoes can learn to associate DEET with the presence of blood meals, they might overcome their aversion to it. This has significant implications for disease transmission, particularly for dengue, yellow fever, and Zika, all of which are transmitted by Aedes aegypti. Understanding mosquito learning and behavior is crucial for developing effective long-term mosquito control strategies. From the Hacker News feed, there's a seashell found in the middle of the desert that became a whole GitHub investigation. This kind of thing is what makes the internet wonderful. Someone finds something seemingly out of place, a seashell in the desert, and it turns into a detailed examination of geology, ancient seas, and fossil formation. Many desert regions were once underwater, and you can find marine fossils in seemingly unlikely places. The GitHub repository documenting the investigation is a great example of citizen science and collaborative learning. On the mathematical side, there's a gentle introduction to lattice-based cryptography available as a PDF that got 86 points on Hacker News. Lattice-based cryptography is particularly important right now because it's believed to be resistant to quantum computing attacks. As quantum computers develop, they'll be able to break RSA and elliptic curve cryptography, the two main types of public key cryptography used today. Lattice-based systems, along with other post-quantum approaches, are being standardized now so that we can transition critical systems before quantum computers become a threat. The math is more involved than traditional public key cryptography, but papers like this one at Cryptography 100 and 1.ca help make it accessible. There's also a pictorial introduction to differential geometry from 2017 that resurfaced on Hacker News. Differential geometry is the mathematics of curved spaces, and it's fundamental to general relativity and modern physics. Having a pictorial introduction is valuable because differential geometry can be quite abstract, and visualizations help build intuition. Space and science continue to deliver fascinating discoveries and developments. From the hardware being prepared for future missions to the ongoing productivity of decades-old telescopes like Hubble, we're living in a remarkable era of discovery. And the biological research on mosquito learning reminds us that even the smallest creatures can surprise us with their complexity. Segment 9, Business and Economy. Let's wrap up with a look at business and economic news that affects the tech world and beyond. There's been significant movement in both markets and major business deals this week. Starting with a major acquisition, Accenture announced it's acquiring Ookla, the company best known for Speedist. This is getting significant attention with 287 points and 145 comments on Hacker News. Ookla has massive amounts of data about internet performance worldwide from all those speed tests people run. Accenture's acquisition is about strengthening their network intelligence and experience capabilities with data and AI for enterprises. For Accenture's consulting clients, having access to real-world network performance data could be valuable for planning deployments, optimizing network architectures, and understanding where connectivity issues exist. The deal also represents the continuing consolidation in the network intelligence space. From a user perspective, the question is whether Speedist will remain free and independent or whether it gets absorbed into Accenture's enterprise offerings. The comment thread on Hacker News shows the community is skeptical about what this means for Ookla's consumer-facing tools. Bloomberg is reporting on several international business developments. Singapore's CapitaLand is shedding 10% of its China staff amid the real estate downturn there. China's property sector has been in distress for several years now, and companies with exposure to that market continue to face challenges. CapitaLand is one of Asia's largest diversified real estate groups, and cutting 10% of staff in China is a significant move that signals they're adjusting to a new reality in that market. Indonesia is advancing its export control plan despite uncertainty. Export controls are becoming increasingly important in the geopolitical landscape, particularly around technology, minerals, and strategic resources. Indonesia has significant reserves of nickel and other materials crucial for battery production, so export controls there could affect global EV supply chains. In tragic news from China, a mine collapse killed 5 workers just days after another deadly blast in Shanxi. Mining remains one of the most dangerous industries globally, and these incidents highlight the ongoing safety challenges, particularly in resource extraction. These kinds of accidents often lead to questions about safety regulations, enforcement, and the balance between economic development and worker safety. The African Development Bank is allocating $650 million for a Uganda railroad project. Infrastructure development across Africa continues to be a major investment area, with railroads crucial for economic development and regional connectivity. Modern rail infrastructure can transform economies by reducing transportation costs and improving logistics. On the U.S. jobs front, Bloomberg reports that the upcoming jobs report is set to reveal solid growth with a steady unemployment rate. The labor market has remained surprisingly resilient despite economic headwinds and inflation. For tech workers specifically, the market has been more challenging, with continued layoffs at major tech companies even as the broader economy shows strength. There's a disconnect between headline employment numbers and the tech sector specifically, where companies are still working through the overhiring of the pandemic era. From Ars Technica, there's political and economic news with environmental implications. Environmentalists are turning out in force to oppose Trump coal ash rollbacks. Coal ash, the residue left after burning coal for power, contains heavy metals and other toxic substances. How it's stored and disposed of has significant environmental implications. Rollbacks of regulations around coal ash disposal raise concerns about groundwater contamination and public health. There's also news about proposed new U.S. funding rules that would allow the government to cancel any grant at any time. This comes from the Office of Management and Budget and has significant implications for scientific research, which often relies on multi-year grants. If researchers can't depend on committed funding being available for the duration of projects, it makes long-term research planning nearly impossible. The Ars article frames this as another attempt to cripple U.S. science. In international politics affecting business, there's news about Kenyan courts blocking the Trump administration from dumping Ebola-exposed Americans there. This relates to the ongoing Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo that MSF is warning about. The BBC reports the Ebola spread in Dr. Congo is deeply alarming. From a business perspective, disease outbreaks affect international travel, supply chains, and economic activity. The response to outbreaks also requires significant funding and resources. Looking at the botnet news that appeared across multiple sources, the dismantling of a botnet with more than 17 million infected devices is significant. Both Ars Technica and Bleeping Computer covered this, with Krebs on Security providing additional details about the Netherlands seizing 800 servers and making arrests. The economic impact of botnets is substantial. They're used for DDoS attacks that disrupt businesses, for click fraud that steals advertising dollars, for cryptocurrency mining that costs victims in electricity and hardware wear, and for spam distribution. A botnet of 17 million devices represents enormous illicit computing power. The Dutch law enforcement action, in coordination with international partners, shows the kind of cooperation needed to combat cyber-criminal infrastructure. Bleeping Computer also reported on California's Attorney General suing 23andMe over the 2023 breach that exposed health data. The business implications here are significant. 23andMe has faced substantial challenges since that breach, and now faces legal action from California over how they handled customer data. For the broader genetic testing industry, this creates regulatory pressure and potential liability that will affect how these companies operate and secure their data. The economy continues to show mixed signals. Traditional indicators like employment remain strong, but there are concerns about inflation, interest rates, and regional variations. The tech sector specifically is going through a recalibration after years of rapid growth and hiring. Major acquisitions like Accenture continue, showing that companies with strong balance sheets see opportunity in consolidation. And the global nature of modern business means that events in China's real estate market, Uganda's infrastructure development, or Dutch law enforcement actions against botnets all ripple through the interconnected economy. Segment 10, outro, that brings us to the end of today's episode of the Clovis Brief. We covered a lot of ground today, from major security vulnerabilities being actively exploited to fascinating AI research on topics ranging from video generation to robotics perception. We looked at major infrastructure releases like NixOS 26.05, explored what's happening with NASA's space missions, and examined the business landscape from the Accenture acquisition to the massive botnet takedown. Tomorrow we'll be diving into whatever develops overnight and into months.